But anyways, I'm going to talk about designing puzzles, the CSE models. And for those who has been watching the IGJ Albany talk, might be already familiar with this. But hoi, my name is Taro. I make a lot of puzzle games. You can see a pretty thorough list right here. You can find them at omiyagames.com. I'm going to keep moving on. So the CSE model works as follows. It's 3 different components: the clues, the sequencing, and the execution, exactly in that order. And the attempt with this model is to kind of recreate the thought process of how a player tries to figure out what the puzzle is, like how to solve a specific puzzle, the steps that they take, and then eventually eventually at the execution level realize either it was the wrong solution or they got the whole thing correct. If it's the wrong solution, they go back to the clues step again and then keep moving forward, going through this cycle over and over until they finally solve the problem. But what does each of these stages stand for? Let's start with collecting clues. The collecting clues is basically any segment where it involves trying to look for any sort of cues, any sort of audios, and so forth, to figure out how to basically find hints and clues that one would think would help them get closer to solving a puzzle. So one thing is, first off, recognizing an actual puzzle itself. If you have a big door with a lock on it, that is a recognition of a puzzle, right? Because that means you probably want to go through that door at some point. Then second, figuring out what is interactable. Most walls are not interactable, but if you're in a Zelda game and you're slapping a wall with the sword and it makes a different sound, that might be a bombable wall. So you want to make sure that you're trying to look for in a lot of games where puzzle is involved, a lot of players will look for anything in it where it might, any sort of corner, wall, floor, patches, ceiling, in an attempt to figure out what is interactable and what isn't. There are also tools to overcome a puzzle. You might be collecting a bunch of items in a Zelda game, and then also tools to interactable combination, such as, wait, I got an item. Well, what does this do? It works on X, Y, and Z patches in the game. So these two kind of go hand in hand together, but nonetheless, it's kind of important to recognize what capabilities that you have. And then for some games, you can even combine tools together. And so that's another clue that you need to take into consideration. So on and so forth. Lots of other ways that you can kind of place clues into your game and let them, and kind of silently push and nudge the player towards a solution of the puzzle itself. And then we have the sequencing. The sequencing part is very simple. It's simply figuring out, taking all that information you collected together from that clues section and trying to come out with some sort of linear steps, 1, 2, 3 steps that gives you, lets you know what you're supposed to do so that you can solve the puzzle itself. And finally, the execution. This is actually executing the sequence of events that you created inside your head and you said, okay, I think this is going to work. Let's see if that is the solution. So what makes this model really useful? Well, it's simple. First, it helps us inform how to design a puzzle at all. So basically, since the way the player thinks is in this specific fashion, we can just simply reuse that same thought process and create a system right here to design a puzzle, which is simply, one, place a bunch of breadcrumbs of the mechanics in the game. Or if you're already talking about someplace in the middle of the game, or you're doing the whole Nintendo thing where you design a puzzle where you design tutorials at the very end, and you're just trying to throw a bunch of things together right at once, then the first thing you want to do is list out what is the knowledge, what is the mindset of the player at this point? How much clues have they collected? What do they already know? You want to list all that out. Then two, you want to list out a flowchart of a series of actions and the effect of taking said action. You want to put that into a flowchart and kind of make it into a sort of a sequence of events happening. And finally, three, you design a level. You basically gray block and block out a level that allows you to execute that specific flowchart that you've created previously. It also informs where a puzzle should focus based on genre. So examples of this includes, for example, any games that really focuses on the clue collecting are point-and-click adventures and visual novels. Naturally, because both of these games are all about trying to, well, for point-and-click adventure, trying to collect as many things as possible in your inventory, and for visual novels, try to get as many information about the person you're talking about so that you can better converse with them. Examples of games with strong sequencing are often puzzle games. People in puzzle games don't actually like looking for clues. They want to kind of figure things out themselves. So the sequence often becomes the heavier focus. And of course, action adventures such as the aforementioned Legend of Zelda series, where it's already pre-puzzle heavy from the first place. And finally, games with strong execution area, obviously action games, where you know, they probably don't want to think through about looking for clues and looking for sequencing when all they really want is trying to get as much action as possible. It also informs how to expand a puzzle over time. So one thing that I believe, in fact, Platinum themselves has stated in their GDC talk is that on the bottom right here, the action games shifting from the execution focus to the sequencing. One thing that interesting that they do is they ask about the question of how do we make encounters. They think of ways as how to make an encounter specifically interesting, less so than the action itself. And one way to easily do that is to shift your gameplay style to asking the question of what is the order I should be defeating these enemies in, not just, you know, can I slaughter them all or that kind of stuff. Again, this is something you want to do over time, not obviously at the beginning where people in an action game are probably not having that expectation. I also gave a couple of other examples at the very top right here, adventure games. Obviously, there's only so much you can do from trying to collect as many items into your inventory as possible before the player gets very bored about that, you know, hide and seek mechanic. So instead, as your game evolves over time, it'll be a good idea to start shifting that to the sequencing thought process of the game. And of course, puzzle games can push in both different directions, from sequencing to clues or from sequencing to executions. Most puzzle games goes from sequencing to clues instead, because as the puzzles gets harder, the sequence gets longer. That's fine, dandy and all, but you also want to make sure that the player feels smarter by giving enough hints and, you know, clues as to what that sequence actually is. Whereas for action games like Legend of Zelda games, you know, there's no reason not to push the sequencing section into more action-heavy stuff, where the window of margin of error decreases over time. It also informs the priority of how to debug a failing puzzle. By failing puzzle, I'm talking about puzzles that players are having a difficult time solving or are not having all that fun solving at all. So first, I will check the clues. Check to see if the player has the correct mental mindset and that they have all the information necessary to solve said puzzle. If they don't have that, then obviously that's a problem, right? It will be very frustrating to try to solve a puzzle when you're missing that last puzzle piece. So you want to make sure you try to solve that. You also want to remove any red herrings as well. Red herrings are actually a really bad idea in adding into puzzle games because it's just going to confuse the player and it's going to remove the focus from the puzzle of the game itself. So make sure that you're reducing any red herrings as well. Next, check to see if the player understands the sequence of the actions that they must take. So they're having a hard time solving a puzzle. Okay, what are the steps that they're taking? What are the sequence of actions they're taking that they think is the solution of it? Check to see if that sequence is too complex or not. That might be a good idea. It might be a good idea to survey your players to see, hey, if this puzzle, if you're having so much difficulty with this puzzle, you know, one, is it because you're not having fun? Are you having fun with trying to solve the puzzle? Yes or no. And two, if you're not having fun with a puzzle, well, what was the sequence of events that you were thinking that would work, and why is it that isn't, you know, fulfilling? If neither of these seems to be the actual problem, oh yeah, and obviously easy ways to solve this includes adding more clues. But anyways, if neither of these seems to be a solution to these problems, then probably your window of margin of error is a little too small. So you want to make sure that you increase that margin of error when the execution part becomes too difficult for the player. Normally, for most game designers, I think they'll pretty much figure out which part of these sections is actually problematic than needing to actually go through these sequentially. But in this case where you literally have no information and you have no idea where to start, then this order is what I recommend. And that's it. That is basically my model. Are there any questions? There is one question, and if I can have someone hand Alana a microphone, that'd be great.
So my question, I was just thinking of examples of bad puzzles in games, but
there are a lot.
The one that immediately came to mind was in Castlevania 2. There's a famous part for the NES where you had to have a certain item in your inventory. You had to stand up against you had to kneel up against a wall and like press down or something for like 5 seconds, and the clues were not really there to really understand how to do it. And so it was one of those examples of where the clues weren't there and the sequencing wasn't really clear, and then the execution was kind of obscure, and just became an infamous bad puzzle in gaming. But I was wondering if you had an example of other famous bad puzzles.
I think it's called Snow Peak Mountains or something or other. Majora's Mask, Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask is actually one of my favorite games of all time. But boy, the clue that the game gives you that, hey, looks like you can somehow knock these things out or something or other is what the game tells you. But you look at it and you're like, this is a big honking gigantic tower. What item could possibly ever knock this tower over? Like, there's nothing in there that makes you go, oh, that makes a whole lot of sense. Unless, for whatever reason, you happen to be Japanese and you know what game they're referencing, which is a very small children's game that is actually very difficult to play, by the way. But the solution to said puzzle is literally donning your Goron suit and then punching the tower, and that causes bits and parts of it to fall off. But there is absolutely no way you would have known that without any cultural relevancy in it. And I mean, I feel is sort of a failing on the Western audience, because they have no such cultural background. There's nothing on that tower's marking that even remotely hints you that it's supposed to be based off of this game. And like from a visual perspective, it's just like this big, gigantic tower that looks completely immovable, and in no way like does the clue make any single sense. So that's one that immediately comes to my mind. No offense to board games and like especially puzzle games, when you go to Barnes and Noble or some sort of bookstore and they have those like brain teasing games where you try to, it tells you you should start your piece in these formations and you can only move your pieces in this way, and then you have to move them out and that kind of stuff. I'm not a huge fan of those puzzles either. They're not very good puzzle games in my opinion, because they're not like, a lot of the clues are deliberately obscured, or else the puzzle itself would have been a lot easier to solve. And so the sequencing part is, while technically important, there's nothing in the manual or in the game design itself, and again, this is most likely because of the limitation of being a board or a puzzle or a jigsaw thing, that there's not a whole lot of clues there to be able to piece together what the sequence is. But a lot of video games that tries to emulate that specific game feel often, I feel, has that same problem, where the game design itself is not made to provide clues to the player what the proper sequence of events that they need to take is.
I just have to say frog fractions. That's all. Press down.
To Frog Fraction's credit, it does give you a hint. There's a down arrow key and an up arrow key. The only problem is that it disappears after a while. That's also not to mention that Frog Fractions isn't really so much a puzzle game as a joke game, in a way, I'd argue. Because once you bypass the first section of the game, like, the game is absurdly linear, and only bits and parts of it is actually all that puzzle heavy.